Lecture, we wish to outline the eschatology of victory among the Afrikaners in the 20th century, giving a general bird's eye view. Now, in the last lecture, we arrived at the debacle and the defeat of the Afrikaners after the Anglo-Boer War, the Second South African War between the Afrikaners and the British Empire, which ended in 1902 after 3 years of bitter fighting in the defeat of the small number of Afrikaner troops, outnumbered 25 to 1 on the field, and in the annexation of the old South African Republic and the Orange Free State Republic by Britain and their incorporation into the British Commonwealth. The next 10 years in South Africa were years of great difficulty. Many of the Afrikaners were very depressed. I should imagine psychologically they felt during that time frame the way in which the Southerners felt in the United States after their defeat in the decade following the American War between the states. Today there are monuments that have been erected commemorating that period of time. One of them is of a man wounded in his side, clutching at the wound with the words underneath, gewond maar onoorwonnen, which means wounded but unconquered. Point of fact, though, the Afrikaner became very impoverished, disappropriated as a result of the loss of the war, economically ruined to a large extent. In many, many cases, his women and children had died in the British concentration camps. Farms were burned down, and the destruction was awful and horrible to contemplate. And yet, even during those 10 years, life had to go on. A very significant development was the establishment of so-called Christian national schools. These were privately owned schools, generally started by the South African Reformed churches, meeting in facilities owned by the church, financed by the church. The church, of course, was struggling financially at that time too, and operating independently of the public school system, which had now fallen into the hands of the British conquerors, and which had now become a tool for decalvinization, at least for a long while, and of Anglicization, of turning the Afrikaner nation into an English-speaking integral part of the British Empire. So the emergence of these Christian national schools during the decade 1900 to 1910 is a very important factor. Now, by 1910, the forces of union, the forces promoting the idea of the British Commonwealth in South Africa, and especially in the two conquered South African republics, the forces of union were strong enough to attempt to demand the Afrikaners' allegiance to England as an integral part of the British Commonwealth. There were those that resisted, but they were in a minority even amongst the Afrikaners. And yet the Christian national schools, rising out of the ashes of military defeat, had, during that 10-year frame, nevertheless become strong enough and produced enough graduates to have offered a further stout resistance to the process of Anglicization of the Afrikaner. And so by 1910, we find those militant Afrikaners who were now in the minority even among their own nation, nevertheless having become strong enough to demand at least equality for the Afrikaans language alongside of English in the new South Africa that was emerging. In 1910, the National Convention was held in South Africa, at which political representatives of the various states of South Africa, the Cape, Natal, the Orange Free State, and the old South African Republic, which was now called the Transvaal, and so forth, all sent their representatives to this National Convention for the purpose of creating what became known as the Union of South Africa. Most of the representatives were pro-union, those who were anti-union and for independence of the, especially for independence of the previous Orange Free State Republic and South African Republic, stayed away from the convention, didn't want to cooperate with it, though some went there and fought the idea of union. There was a lot of talk at this convention as to whether, once the idea of amalgamation of the various states in South Africa had been approved, there was a lot of discussion as to whether the amalgam should take on the form of a union, as in the United States of America today, or whether it should take on the form of a confederacy, as in the old Confederate states of the southern states of America at the time of the war between the states. And after a great deal of talk one way and the other, all of the people who were there and in favor of amalgamation decided on union rather than on confederation. I'm not sure that that was a wise move looking back, but that's the move that they did make. And both sides, I should say the two ex-British colonies of the Cape and Natal on the one hand, and the two ex-Afrikaner republics, the Free State and the South African Republic, the Transvaal on the other hand, had to make concessions toward the idea of union. They decided on two official languages, English and Afrikaans, and that from now on, all legal documents in all of the states would be published in both of these two official languages, even if in a state such as Natal hardly any Afrikaans was spoken, even if in a state such as the Orange Free State no English was spoken. And so this uniform language policy, at least on paper, was enacted and spread throughout the land. A second difficult decision that needed to be made was the matter of what legal system to follow. In the Cape, of course, there had been massive influences of English law, and especially British statute law, that had been superimposed upon and had replaced large segments of the Calvinistic Roman Dutch law, which had preceded it there. And it was finally decided that the system of Roman Dutch law would prevail throughout the whole of South Africa, even throughout the former British colonies of the South. However, the whole of criminal law in South Africa and criminal procedure was, from this point on out, coast to coast, derived from British law rather than from Roman Dutch law. So really what you have in South Africa today, and in Rhodesia to the north of South Africa, that's the new Zimbabwe, is Roman Dutch law except for criminal law and criminal procedure. In that area, British law is followed. And then there were also difficulties in arriving at a unitary educational program. After a great deal of debate at the National Convention, it was felt that as far as education was concerned, they would be on a confederate base rather than on a federal base. So to this day, South Africa has no uniform public educational system. The Transvaal has one system of education, and the Free State another, and so forth. Incidentally, the Transvaal state, to this day, by far the most powerful and the richest state, most of the gold deposits being found there, has refused to allow evolution to be taught in the curriculum of the primary or the secondary public school system to this very day. And so there were these differences in educational approach, differences in the extent to which bilinguality was achieved in the various portions of the country. They also wrestled a tremendous degree at the National Convention with the racial situation in South Africa. Perhaps not so much as previously the relationship between white Afrikaner South Africans on the one hand and the white English-speaking South Africans who had arrived in the country only from 1820 onward, on the other hand, that too, but they particularly wrestled with the future pattern as to the relationship between all of the white people on the one hand, whether they were to speak English or Afrikaans, in their relationship to all of the various black peoples of South Africa, regardless of the many, many different tribes and differences between the black nations which obtained. This was not really a problem at all back in 1910, because the black peoples at that time were very, very primitive. But it was foreseen that they would develop, and particularly as they became more and more Christianized, that either the country would have to head in the direction of ultimate integration and absorption of these huge number of blacks into the fabric of white society, with the inevitable shift that would involve from South Africa being a Western nation to South Africa becoming a black nation with some vestiges of Western influence, or on the other hand that the future direction of South Africa would have to involve some kind of segregation between whites on the one hand and blacks on the other, leading to a policy of good neighborliness ultimately, in terms of which the whites could preserve their Western culture and the blacks could preserve their African culture, both of them hopefully being Christian nations by that time and more Christianized, until ultimately they could coexist as neighbors, not mixed up with one another, but alongside of one another, helping one another and borrowing and lending to one another on a basis of formal equality. The side of this would be the situation that you had wherever the white man extended his control in South Africa over various groups of black people. Round about this general time, a very interesting, actually a little before this time, a very interesting situation took place in the north of the Transvaal. There was a group of black people called the Bavenda, the Venda people. They lived in a very beautiful area of South Africa, in what is now the northeast of the Transvaal state, an area rather more mountainous and lakey, than much of the rest of the country, which is desert. At any rate, the Bavenda people, who are black, are very different to the other black groups surrounding them to the north and the east and the west, the white South Africans being to the south of them. And the Bavenda people at this time found themselves on the receiving end from more aggressive and unsympathetic black people to the north, and the Bavenda people appealed to the South African Republic, the white people, to their south to protect them against the black tribe to the north that was giving them a difficult time. And so the white Christian South African Republic extended its control over Vendaland, establishing it as a protectorate. But at this point the difficulties began. The Bavenda were pagans at that time, and they had a rather obnoxious practice in terms of which when the girls of the village would reach puberty as a class, the local witch doctor would shake his dice and then point to one of these girls of the group who would be required to bear the sins of the whole class. And this poor unfortunate girl was thereupon required to have sexual intercourse with her own father in front of the onlooking villagers. And after that, if that wasn't enough, the girl was then picked up and tossed to the local holy crocodile in the nearby lake. Well, you can imagine that after the white Calvinists had extended their control at the invitation of these black people over this territory to protect this particular black tribe against other black tribes to the north, it posed a severe problem, this practice, to the white government. And what the white government did was to put a stop to that practice as being intolerable in terms of the teaching of the Bible, and that upset some of the Venda at the time. The way I like to put it is the witch doctor was upset about it, and the crocodile was very upset about it. He didn't get his meal from here on out, but at least one village virgin, and in fact the rest of them too, who might have been bait, were rather grateful to the white government for the intervention. You've had these kind of problems that have arisen from time to time. On the whole, though, the general stance of the South African governments has been to allow and to leave the black people in areas which the whites have controlled from time to time to determine their own destiny and to preserve their own language and their own culture, while attempting to Christianize these black people, but not to turn them into black Europeans or into black white South Africans, if there could be such a thing, but to turn the non-Christian black Venda into Christian black Venda, rather than to try to turn them into black Afrikaners, if there could be such a thing. And so there is obviously a tension in this kind of situation, a tension between people who don't always understand one another's languages, between people who are of entirely different cultural backgrounds, between peoples at different levels of civilization, but particularly tension caused between one group of people in whom the Christian ethic is paramount, the white Afrikaners, and another group of people within whom a pagan religion is paramount. The direction, though, is clearly to develop the country into a system of different states in which it is hoped ultimately all of the various groups of people, each living in their own area, will be Christian people. They'll be different from one another, but they'll be united in Christ. And today I'm happy to say that this very black territory we've been talking about, Venderland, has to quite a considerable extent been Christianized, at least nominally, and it is now a self-governing republic in South Africa. Venderland has left the nation of South Africa. The independence of Venderland and of other black territories too, let me add, such as the Transkei and Bophuthatswana, have been recognized by the white government. They maintain ambassadors with one another. They are adopting a policy of increasing good neighborliness as the black areas more and more develop, and are being helped ever increasingly by investment of entrepreneurs, especially at this stage of white South African entrepreneurs working in the black areas, however, whose maximum profits have been given a ceiling by the white government, which really wants the white people there not to get rich, but to help the black people get established and to establish a strong black middle class just as quickly as possible. And then the hope is that the black people will themselves opt for free enterprise, and that you will have the emergence of the black capitalist in the black area. This is the scheme that the white South African government is trying to promote with varying degrees of success at the moment. I may add that South Africa is the only country in the world today which officially, white South Africa, which officially recognizes the independence of these black republics over which it had been asked to extend a protectorate in earlier days. And one of the saddest things is that the United Nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany absolutely refuse to recognize the independent status and countryness of these black areas in South Africa today. And so you've got the very interesting phenomenon that here are two countries, a black country and a white country, trading with one another, maintaining diplomatic relations with one another within South Africa, with the rest of the world ignoring it as if it had never happened, and of course not wanting it to happen, because the implications would be A, that Venderland and the Transkei and Bophuthatswana and all of these other independent black nations would then have to be given independent seats at the United Nations, and that, secondly, would indeed demonstrate to the world that the South African policy of separate development is working. And that, of course, would be lethal to the liberal who doesn't want to see it work, and who believes in amalgam and integration rather than in good neighborliness between man and his fellow man, respecting one another's differences and rights to be different. Well, now, by 1910, going back to the situation at the time of the Union of South Africa, when all of these future developments had to be projected as best they could at that time in a country itself ruined by war just 10 years earlier, by 1910, 21.5% of the population of South Africa was white. By 1980, this figure has gone down to 17%, 17%. By the year 2000, it is projected that only 13% of the population of South Africa will still be white. Now, this is not so much on account of the arrival of birth control methods. The fact is that the growth rate of the white South African is considerably higher than the growth rate of the white man in other countries. They had a very interesting survey several years ago in South Africa, asking Roman Catholic white girls and Calvinist white Afrikaner girls how many children they would like to have in their families. And the replies were very surprising. The average Roman Catholic girl, of course, being implacably opposed to contraception, gave the answer they would like to have 4 children. The average Afrikaner white girl said she would like to have 5 children, if that be possible. And so the size of the white families in South Africa is definitely higher than it is of the white men elsewhere. But if the white South African family produces an average of 4 or 5 children, the black South African families, especially since the advent of white medicine, which has drastically cut down the black death rate, has now risen to some 8 or 9 children per family on the average. And of course, at this point, we run into the theological problems concerning the cultural mandate. God did not say, be fruitful and add and fill the earth, so that 2 people, man and wife, should want to produce only 2 children, who only if those 2 children grow up and both get married and both are fertile, would you be on steady state. But God said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And it would seem to me that that should mean that 2 people getting married should desire to produce a very minimum of 4 children per family, for that alone is multiplication. I believe in the U.S. the average number of children per family is something like 2.2, something in that region today. On the other hand, the Word of God does not say that human beings are to be fruitful and to teem in the way in which the waters did or the insects did. They are merely to rabah in the Hebrew, to multiply, and not to sharat or to teem as did the insects. Of course, this is a problem not just in South Africa, comparing the different growth rates of multiplying whites and almost teeming blacks, but this is a demographic problem throughout the world, inasmuch as in 1900 the white race constituted approximately 1/6 of all the people in the world, including the Southern Europeans and the South Americans in the white race, at which time the white race controlled 90% of the whole world, whereas today the white man controls only 10% of the world, and he has shrunk to a mere 1/8 of the world and is rapidly shrinking to become 1/9 of the world. So what you really have in South Africa demographically is just a small microscopic picture of what is happening to the sons of Japheth throughout the world in our day and age. At any rate, I think it's interesting that with present growth rates, by the year 2000, there will be a slightly lesser percentage of white people in what is today Southern Africa than there will be a percentage of black people in the United States of America. 2000, the white man will represent 13% of Southern Africa. In the year 2000, the black American will represent 14%, at least, of the American population. Of course, these trends can change, but this does seem to be the direction that things are going at the moment. Well, now, in 1914, the First World War broke out, and that was a minor crisis. A great Afrikaner general who had fought bravely for the Orange Free State some 15 years earlier against the British, General Herzog, that's Hertzog, strenuously protested the movement of General Botha, B-O-T-H-A, and his helpmate, General Smuts, S-M-U-T-S. You've probably all heard of General Smuts, one of the greatest men in the world of the 20th century. I'll get into him in a minute. Botha and Smuts wanted South Africa to declare war against Germany just because England had declared war against Germany. General Herzog said, no, let South Africa be neutral in this world war against Germany. Particularly, said Herzog, inasmuch as Germany did not evince any hostility whatsoever towards South Africa 15 years earlier in her war against England, and indeed, to some extent, did help South Africa by at least selling cannon to South Africa in exchange for gold at that time. And so there was a lot of tension during World War I between pro-British white people and, I can't call them anti-British white people, but such white people who wanted neutrality in the war and not to take sides either way. And some fascinating things happened during World War I in South Africa. One was that some rebellions broke out. There was one church in the whole country that split. Church splits are very, very rare in South Africa, I'm happy to say. But in a place called Winburg, W-I-N-B-U-R-G, the birthplace of the first president of the new South African Republic, established in 1961, the Reformed Church split, those who were for neutrality in the war going off to meet on the other side of town. And those two churches are still in that town to this day, even though the reason for the split has now died down. But feelings ran very, very high during the First World War, particularly inasmuch as General Botha and General Smuts, who were running the government at that time, insisted in sending pro-British South African troops north against the Germans into the old German colony of Tanganyika, now called Tanzania, in East Africa, then called German East Africa, and sending other white South African pro-British troops into German Southwest Africa, today called Namibia. Some of the white South Africans that wanted neutrality in this war violently protested. Some of them rebelled against their own white government, not very successfully. But a very interesting phenomenon is that of a General Beyers, B-E-Y-E-R-S. General Beyers was a famous South African general in the South African War some 15 years earlier, and he got up in public at public meetings and called upon the people of South Africa to make peace with Germany and not to fight Britain's war for her. For, said General Beyers, the Bible teaches, Deuteronomy and Proverbs, cursed is he that moves his neighbor's land posts. General Beyers felt that those texts in Deuteronomy and in the book of Proverbs, bringing the curse of Almighty God on anyone who will tamper with the boundary line between his ground and his neighbor's ground, is committing theft against God. And he felt that it's not just individuals who can steal from one another, but nations can steal from one another in ill-founded boundary disputes. And he felt that what Botha and Smuts were doing was transgressing those laws of God in Deuteronomy and in the book of Proverbs, and he protested against what they were doing in the name of the Lord. Well, warrants went out for the arrest of Beyers, and trying to escape from the governmental forces, he was drowned in one of the rivers. The rivers of South Africa are dry most of the year. You can bank on that. It's a very arid country. But at this particular time of the year, the river came down and General Beyers got drowned. Then there was the great General Koos de la Rey, D-E-L-A-R-E-Y, Larey, who had been a loyal general in the forces of the South African Republic in the previous war, and he too was on his way to Johannesburg and Pretoria to speak to Smuts about putting an end to this war that he felt was an ungodly war, and he was gunned down in the streets. And to this day there is a veil of mystery surrounding it. Some say that Smuts deliberately killed him. Others say that, and this is the official line that's put out, that a very vicious bank robber had escaped from jail at this time, and that the police were alerted to shoot this bank robber to kill him, and that the police shot General Delarey thinking that he was a bank robber. And it's too bad, because this man was a hero. But then Delarey should not have been going through the streets. It was said at a time when he knew, or should have known, that the police were out to shoot and kill the bank robber on sight. So you can imagine that feelings ran very, very high in the country at this time. And then there was a young Calvinist called Yuppie Fourie, F-O-U-R-E-I-E, who went into Southwest Africa with General Maritz, M-A-R-I-T-Z, to try to put an end to the fighting between pro-British white South Africans on the one hand and white Germans in German Southwest Africa on the other hand. And this man was being followed and hunted down by the men of General Boter and General Smuts. And a very interesting thing happened. The Sabbath day came round, and Yuppie Fourie, being a good Calvinist, or rather not being as good a Calvinist as he should have been, refused to fight on the Sabbath day. Felt it was a day of rest. Frankly, if he'd known his Bible just a little bit better, he would have realized from Joshua chapter 6 that the armies of the living God circled Jericho for 7 consecutive days, one of which must have been the Sabbath day, seeing there were 7 consecutive days. He doesn't seem to have realized that. One can admire his godliness and devotion to principle, but he was captured on the Sabbath by people who had no problem in shooting on the Sabbath, whereas he did have that problem, and he was shot to death for his role in trying to bring about peace. And so it was that the situation became more and more anarchical in South Africa. Even after the defeat of Germany in 1918, we find a steady deterioration in the situation. We find this creation of a large mass of impoverished white Afrikaners whose farms had been burned out, who had never gotten on their feet again, emotionally or economically or psychologically, and we find these poor whites working in the gold mines. It is at this point that we must go to the Soviet Union, and specifically to Lenin, for the next fascinating chapter in the development of the South African saga. As some of you know, I wrote my second doctorate on communist eschatology and tried to go through all of the works of Lenin and Marx in writing this. And I discovered a fascinating writing of Lenin about this period, in which he comes out violently in favor of the white South Africans and against the British, which he saw as an agency of international capitalism, and totally ignoring the black people of Africa as culturally irrelevant, which by and large at that time they were. And so it was that we find the development of a strong communist movement in South Africa, even among white Afrikaners who had been nominally Calvinist. It was not called a communist party. It became known as the Labour Party of South Africa. And it was rather strongly not only anti-British but anti-black. And meantime, the communist parties throughout the world until deep into the 1930s, were giving support to the policy of racial preference of whites in South Africa, and the South African Communist Party, which also existed separately on a small scale, was violently anti-British and violently anti-black. One of the interesting gymnastic stunts of the South African Communist Party about the time of World War II was its repudiation of its anti-black stance and its attempt to go along with lip service to equality between black and white, which enraged many of its own followers who decommunized on the spot. But that's just an interesting quirk of history. At any rate, there was a big gold miners' strike. The white South African impoverished gold miners struck in 1920. And do you know that the Communist Party exploited that situation so skillfully that a communist republic was proclaimed in South Africa? Johannesburg, or rather Fordsburg, a suburb of Johannesburg, became the new government of South Africa. The red flag was raised. Something similar happened in Ireland, by the way, at about this general time. Old McConnell Street Post Office in Dublin. But at any rate, South Africa was officially a communist country in 1920 for 3 days. But during those 3 days, General Smuts, who was a man of some action, commandeered the army and marched into Johannesburg and gunned down and destroyed this whole garrison of poor white workers who were the dupes of a handful of communist stooges. So he ruthlessly wiped out the communist government and reestablished anti-communist control in South Africa. About the same time, there was a tribe of Hottentots called the Bongoswarts in the extreme west of the country who had refused to pay their dog licenses. And General Smuts, who ran the government at that time, really didn't like it, and he told them they had better pay their dog licenses or else. These yellow-skinned Hottentots refused to do so, and Smuts sent in the Air Force and wiped them out. Well, by this time, the people of South Africa were beginning to think that Smuts' touch was just a little too hard for most of the people. And in 1924, at the election, the South African Party, Smuts' party, was defeated and removed from office, and a coalition government took over between the National Party on the one hand and the Labour Party on the other hand, under the leadership of General Hertzog.
Could you clarify what you mean by dog license?
All right. In South Africa, I don't know when this was first instituted, it is illegal and a crime to own a dog unless you have unless you have acquired a license from the state, the federal government, you would say in America, to have this. I forget what it is, something like about $1 a year. And unless you pay the federal government $1 a year, it's illegal to own a dog. It's a means of raising revenue, also a means of controlling the numbers of mangy-looking, almost rabid dogs that would otherwise roam the streets of this hungry country. All right. We've now clarified what we mean by a dog license. One of the nice things I discovered in coming to America, by the way, is that you were not required to have a license to operate a bicycle, which you are in South Africa, but you are required to have a license to operate a motor car. And I have some difficulty in understanding that distinction, but each country has its own quirks, I guess. At any rate, the 1924, the coalition government between the National Party and the Labour Party took power. The big motto of this coalition government was South Africa first, Suid-Afrika eerste, as Hertzog said, and he followed what he called a two-stream policy, complete equality for the English language and culture and the Afrikaans language and culture. His son, by the way, later became the leader of a purified national party which adopted the cultural mandate, Genesis 1:26, in Article 1 of its constitution. He was in favor of neutrality, not only in the First World War, but later in the Second World War, to which we will come a little later. Meantime, the constitutional developments continued. In 1926, there was a meeting of British Commonwealth Prime Ministers and other governmental officials in London under the leadership of the then British Prime Minister, Lord Balfour. And they came out with what was known as the Balfour Declaration. The gist of the Balfour Declaration of 1926 was that South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Her Majesty's other dominions across the seas were given self-governing dominion status. That is to say, from this point on, they were responsible to their own locally elected and locally legislating governments, and no longer made responsible to the British government sitting in London. However, they did remain Her Majesty's dominions within the British Empire. This was further refined in 1931, where at the Statute of Westminster, the British government formally agreed to accept the sphere sovereignty, apart from itself, of the governments of South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and so forth. In 1927, there was a huge tussle in South Africa about the flag. There were at least three parties. There were those who said that the Union Jack, the flag of England, should be the only flag of South Africa. However, the climate was moving away from this toward the reassertion of a South African nationalism, albeit of a somewhat different type than had prevailed up till 1900. Then there was the extreme right wing that wanted a brand new flag totally different to any flag that had ever been used in South Africa previously. And then there was also another party that wanted the whole of South Africa to adopt the flag of the old South African Republic, the Transvaal. And after a lot of bickering and wrangling, they agreed on a compromise flag that South Africa has to this very day, although there's increasing talk today of changing the flag. And if you look at the South African flag today, you'll see a fascinating phenomenon. It's a flag with three horizontal stripes, bright orange on the top stripe, and then under that white, and underneath that pale blue. That's called the Oranje Blanje Blauw. It is the flag that Jan van Riebeeck, the first governor of the Cape, erected on the shores of Cape Town in 1652. But when you come to the middle strip of the flag, the white strip, there are three smaller flags on that field. The Union Jack, representing the old Cape and Natal states, and in the middle, the flag of the old Orange Free State Republic, and then on the other side of this reflection of the ontological trinity, these three small flags in the middle of a three-lane flag, there is the old flag of the South African Republic. I don't know that there's another flag like that in the world, but I think it says something of the attempts of the South African people by standing up for principle to negotiate a settlement that would be as acceptable as it possibly could to all groups of people. At any rate, so much for the flag. In 1929, South African ambassadors were appointed for the very first time to the United States, Italy, and the Netherlands. Previously, there had been no South African ambassadors anywhere in the world since the British destruction of the South African Republic and the Orange Free State Republic in 1902. In 1931, the World Depression hit. A tremendous controversy was unleashed about the gold standard, and this caused such a political crisis in South Africa that the two former arch enemies, Smuts and Hertzog, who before they had become enemies had previously been associates against the British during the South African War, General Hertzog being a general of the Orange Free State Republic, General Smuts being a general of the South African Republic. These two entered into coalition with one another to try and get South Africa moving again financially. This was a worldwide depression, of course, and it was a shot that went round the world when Wall Street fell and the gold standard was removed in almost every country on the earth. But there were still those in South Africa who refused to enter into this new coalition even to get the country moving again. There was the great Dr. Daniel Francois Malan, M-A-L-A-N, Malan, a clergyman turned politician, dour, obdurate Calvinist. I'll say more about him later. He entered into the opposition as leader of the National Party, as it was called, and also Colonel Stallard, based chiefly in the Natal province, who wanted a return to a completely pro-British control of South Africa. These two very unlikely people formed a coalition with one another as a minority group in opposition against the government. From 1932 to 1937, there was constant agitation for a separate political enfranchisement of non-white voters in their own area. It was felt that in spite of the World Depression, in spite of the difficulties of the relationship between South Africa and England, of the relationship between white Afrikaans-speaking South Africans and white English-speaking South Africans, that they must give more attention to the overall relationship between white people and the various black peoples in South Africa. So they moved another step further in the direction of separate development by removing the handful of black voters from the joint roll and in creating political rights for the black people in their own areas, which they have much more massively developed since that time. In 1938, a major event took place. It was exactly 100 years after the Great Trek took place, when the white South African Afrikaners moved out of the Cape to set up the Republic of Natal, the Orange Free State Republic, and the South African Republic, and feelings began to run high. The Afrikaner found his soul again. He got back to his Calvinist roots, and these are the days of that great ox wagon movement, as epitomized in that poem I read you all the other day. The white child of South Africa treks farther and farther on. Trek on. How far? As far as God gives us the power to trek. And so, with this tremendous national movement of the 100 years centennial celebration of the 1836 ox wagon trek, the National Party began to make great progress with its motto, believe in God, believe in your nation, believe in yourself. And then came the 1939 Second World War. It split white South Africans right down the middle. South African Congress split 80 votes in favor of going to war against Germany, 67 votes in favor of neutrality. World War I all over again. The South African cabinet split. 7 votes in favor of declaring war on Germany, 6 votes in favor of neutrality. And so there was another political realignment, and in September 1939, General Smuts became Prime Minister of South Africa again, replacing the man that he had just been working under, General Hertzog, who said, we cannot get involved in European wars, parallel of American isolationism in South Africa. You see the parallel there. And so the Labour Party and the Dominion Party entered into coalition with General Smuts' South African Party, declared war on Germany, while the Nationalists, under the leadership of Dr. Malan, became the official opposition, and the breakaway followers of General Hertzog, a very small party, became known as the Afrikaner Party, who sometime later amalgamated with the National Party under the title of Reunited National Party. In 1943, after the tide of the war had begun to turn strongly against Germany, the National Party succeeded in gaining 43 seats in the South African Congress. It had been whittled down to 11 some years earlier, but the government still controlled 111 seats in the Congress. But in 1948, there was an election, and by a narrow majority, Dr. Malan, by entering into a coalition with the Afrikaner Party, took over the government of South Africa. I was at school at the time. It was quite dramatic. We'd never had the Bible in a public school before the election. 1 week after the election, the teacher came in with a Bible and said, the government says we've got to teach the Bible throughout the schools of the land. It was that dramatic a change. And immediately we find a dramatic developments and, on the whole, improvements from the Calvinist perspective in education, in politics and economics. A consolidation of Calvinist power in South Africa now took place in politics, economics, and education. In 1960, a national referendum was held to determine whether South Africa should or should not become a republic. It was decided to become a republic, and in 1961, the Republic of South Africa was recreated, acknowledging Almighty God and the necessity of Christian education in its constitution. From 1970 through 1980, period of my general absence from that country, it has been my perception that there has been a vast improvement in race relations between black and white in South Africa, in spite of some isolated and unfortunate incidents, and the move is more and more toward universal education and Christianization of all black people and white people within what is now the Republic of South Africa, prior to its deliberately intended dismemberment to become a system of separate states with the possibility of later confederation. And in the next lecture, we will deal with the eschatology of victory and the political life of the Afrikaner in detail.